Hello and welcome to CivilNet. My name is Maral Tavitian and I'm here with my guest, Ohanyan. She's a professor of political science at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
So one of your areas of research is global security, and I wanted to start off by asking you for an overview of the major security issues in Armenia.
Security itself is a very broad concept. I mean, if we do define it in a traditional way, security usually is associated with pure physical security, the security of the borders, mostly focused on the security of the state itself. But over the past 20 to 30 years, the scholars have started to think much more broadly about security. And here, not only the security of the state becomes important, but also the security of the individuals become critical. Over the years, certain issues have been so-called securitized. For example, environmentalism. Environmental degradation can pose serious security risks for various communities, the rise of environmental refugees, or, for example, the environmental sources of the conflict in Syria are very often neglected. In respect to Armenia, I think the security issues are critical because there are significant changes happening in the world order, or we should call it somewhat world disorder, depending as to what will happen with American foreign policy as to whether or not it will continue to abandon its role as a defender of the liberal values, liberal institutions, and the structures that it created, the rules-based international system that it created along with Europe after World War II. So if United States abandons that role, and then what many scholars are arguing that we're moving into a multipolar world order, or others are pointing out that we'll be moving into a multiplex world, meaning that new regions will rise. And here, of course, for Armenia, this is significant because Turkey will continue to exert or claim significantly more role in global world politics as well as in the region. The same applies to Russia. So in this context, so that's one layer, that there will be new players for Armenia to consider, and for any small states to learn to act independently and to really navigate increasingly unpredictable waters of world politics, if you will. And domestically too. I think over the rise of populism in Europe, as well as in the United States, signaled that globalization, economic globalization in general, the way it has been advanced in the free trade, does have losers, groups that are struggling to adjust to globalization of markets. That also applies to Armenia. So human security becomes an issue. Poverty, definitely, it has some serious political roots in Armenia, meaning the lack of democracy, the need for a rule of law to work better, etc. But there are also some objective global forces that are at play. Small states in general, and Armenia in particular, does not have the resources to have a strong welfare state in order to offset the fluctuations and the challenges, economic challenges imposed by economic globalization worldwide. So that is definitely a factor, another dimension of human security that Armenia needs to consider.
And you mentioned democracy. Could you talk a little bit more about how democratic process connects to human security, and specifically the dangers that arise when the population feels as though it can't change the power through free and fair elections?
That can be quite destabilizing. I mean, we saw it last year with Sasnazaret events. I mean, if one of the strengths of democratic systems in general is that they provide multiple avenues of participation, multiple mechanisms of contestation, mechanisms for people to register their discontent, and the system as a whole learns to address those conflicts in a peaceful way. Whether it's the elections, whether it's peaceful protests, whether it's challenging the tickets in court, the parking ticket, for example, variety of forms. When only few of those mechanisms are working, and specifically the elections in particular, that does create instabilities because that pushes people, makes violence as a more legitimate way of addressing these grievances. At the same time, people can also vote with their feet, not being able to register their issues through existing institutions, not to be able to register their human insecurities, issues of unemployment, issues of poverty. People can demonstrate, but they also can actually build into issues of immigration. So elections in particular, though, I think, and people tend to be divided on this as to, number one, how important the elections are as a mechanism of democracy, building a democracy, because so much work needs to happen. Political life is important prior to the elections, and I agree with that. But the elections, electoral politics is critical because that is the only day when people come together, ideally in large numbers, to register their preference for one or a particular party or an individual. And global security implications of elections of the ballot box are enormous. As I mentioned earlier, the external champions of liberal values do not necessarily have the appetite to defend those values. So we'll see what's going to happen in the West with European Union and United States. So it really is these are testing times for Armenia as well as for Georgia, smaller states, for them to really for individuals to defend their rights, their political rights. So electoral integrity is really the foundation of a strong Armenian statehood.
Right. And in the region, Armenia has very few role models of strong liberal democracy. How does it begin to move toward that goal without the kind of regional examples?
I think you're absolutely right to point out the importance of the role models. Studies show that there are regional spillovers. That political processes tend to spill over from country to country. I think Georgia is a good example. I mean, it's not a consolidated democracy, but I do consider Georgia to be a very successful model of how state building is happening. Obviously, Georgia itself is divided between East or West. I was talking to a Georgian colleague a few days ago, and he was complaining as to how divided the space, the media is between, in terms of advocating for policies towards Russia versus the West. And obviously, the role of independent media is critical. But in respect to global trends as well as role models, overall. Right now, actually, over the past 10 to 15 years, and I don't have the precise numbers in front of me, but the trend, unfortunately, is of democratic decline. And most of the democratic erosion has been happening in Europe. Which is really fascinating. But at the same time, looking back in history, I think democracy, I do not think it's a Western value. I do not think basic human rights are Western notions. I vehemently disagree with those. So Armenia has been learning its own lessons, I would argue, since we have to remember it is a young state, and it is considered a hybrid regime. Various classifications will put Armenia either as a illiberal democracy or a liberal authoritarianism, so it depends on the rankings. But what is really unique about Armenia is that it does have a very vibrant civil society. Elections are happening. Obviously, there is electoral fraud. Obviously, administrative resources were used in the last election for those purposes, but at the same time, there were bright cases of the institution of electoral monitoring that seems to be working from one election to the other, and I understand people, again, are dissatisfied with the outcome, but I think managing expectations is critical. In the past elections, there were several individuals from diaspora that actually came to Armenia and served in those roles, and to those individuals, I say it's a great habit to cultivate. And I think, speaking of the diaspora should have a role in participating in Armenia's day-to-day state building processes.
How would it go about doing that?
That's such a huge question. Actually,
Yeah.
I was talking to a colleague and we're trying to figure out how to, well, let me answer it from a perspective, from the United States perspective.
Right.
As in, I go back and forth between United States and Armenia. But in the United States, I think what I would call for, actually, more spaces of public discussion informing diasporans, individuals, Armenians living abroad as to what's happening in Armenia, the good and the bad. There's very little information. I mean, very small group is following closely as to what's happening, and these individuals are really exciting. They come and go. Some have networks here, support system to be able to come and go, but most of them don't. So I don't know. If we were to brainstorm, imagine if on Sundays when people go to church and then go to their coffee hour, imagine if there was a space that they could have conversations on as to what is happening in Armenia right now, presentations on topics. But right now there are very few spaces like that as to what's happening in Armenia. And as a result, people tend to have kind of extreme views on Armenia. They don't, so very kind of seasoned, sophisticated understanding, nuanced, granular understanding of the daily life, whether in the economic sector, social life, or political life. I think those narratives are not there yet.
And I want to pivot to talk a little bit about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In your view, does the unresolved conflict hinder the process of democracy promotion in Armenia as a whole?
It's there are studies that will demonstrate, that argue that unresolved conflicts do produce militarization, and the strengthening of the militarization sooner or later comes and erodes the rest of the institutions in the country. So there are studies that will show that militarization is not, and unresolved conflicts are not good for democracy. At the same time, the opposite is also an important question to ask, meaning to what extent is the lack of consolidated democracy, lack of consolidated democracy become a factor for the lack of resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So it's really a chicken or the egg thing. So imagine if Azerbaijan was not a petrostate, if Azerbaijan, with civil society was not under such pressure. I mean, there's not much of a civil society, unfortunately, to talk about. That makes it difficult for Armenian civil society to build bridges for track 2 efforts, which would have definitely be an enormous strength in terms of the confidence building measures. And here I actually have a bone to pick with the donor community, Western donor community in particular. After Armenia did the U-turn in 2013 and did not sign the Eastern Partnership agreements, the Western donors, most of them, started pulling their money out of Armenia and directing it to Georgia. It's fine for Georgia, but I think what they ended up doing, they undermined the civil society, they weakened, withdrew much needed support in a much needed critical time, preaching to the choir, essentially allocating the money, giving the money, funding to countries that are already on the democratic track. That's fine, but again, you're preaching to the choir. So that in that respect. But again, in respect to democracy and the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, in the peace processes, that is particularly important to consider. Peace processes right now, and this is not very different from many other conflict areas, peace processes are very narrow. They involve very small group of people. They're mostly political, so and somewhat isolated on both sides. Armenian, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh, obviously within the OSCE framework, Nagorno-Karabakh does not even have a seat. So that is problematic, in my view, as to number one, whether you can achieve an agreement if you're meeting with your counterpart maybe once a year or twice a year. So the frequency of the meetings is important. That's number one. And number two, there's very little engagement with the civil society. Some of my respondents from a research that I'm doing pointed out that civil society has lots of lessons learned in terms of security issue areas. But right now, the engagement with civil society between the government and in Armenia is quite sporadic, mostly within the framework of existing Western donor conferences, what have you. When it comes to Armenia-Russia relationships, Armenia-Eurasian Economic Union, there's not much happening in terms of civil society engagement. And what it does to the peace process is that it undermines diversity of the views. There are options in terms of the creativity of the ideas that could be discussed, new stakeholders that could be brought in. Women are not even part of the equation at all. They are not part of the negotiations at all. They are not consulted. Yet studies also show that the inclusion of women does contribute directly to forging successful peace agreements and also implementing them.
Right.
So that link is, that's how I see the link between democracy and the peace processes.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And thank you for watching CivilNet.